All right, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to the virtual learning course, Communication is Key, taking your project management from Satisfactory to Superior. I'm Sarah Snavely from Timmons Group, and I will be moderating today's session. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. This presentation is being provided both via audio and web conference and will last approximately 60 minutes. So if you have questions at any point during today's presentation, go ahead and submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Also, please note that this is worth one AIA HSW credit. So certificates of completion will be sent out to all attendees after the conclusion of the presentation. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. From Timmons Group, we have Amelia Wehunt, Scott Wiley, Roger Rodriguez, and Drew Gould. And with that, Amelia, I combined your name, excuse me. Amelia, take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. My name is Amelia Wehunt, and for those of you that don't know me, I'm a senior project management manager at Timmons Group, and I lead our urban design practice. I've actually just celebrated my lucky 13th work anniversary with Timmons Group back in June. Not saying that I'm superstitious, but I don't know. It seems like it's coincided with a very interesting year. But nevertheless, I'm going to kick off our presentation today with some basics on communications, and then our other presenters will cover highlights of some key topics. Our time is limited to the hour, like Sarah mentioned, but we'll be monitoring the chat in an effort to have time for questions and answers and discussion at the end. And if we're not able to get to your question or point of discussion, I would encourage you to follow up with either Sarah, myself, or one of our other speakers today to continue the conversation. So communication is one of those things that is so universal and inherent to our everyday lives that we don't usually stop to think about what it really is or what it really means. I was asked in a job interview at the end of college what effective communication means to me, and I totally froze. I had no idea how to answer. And it's one of those moments that's really stuck with me over the years and just pushed me to be better prepared and to really internalize and learn what effective communication actually does mean to me. And it's a relatively simple question. What does effective communication mean to you? And by the end of our time today, you should be better prepared to answer that question than I was probably at 22, but also more importantly, you should be able to implement the tools and strategies discussed in today's presentation to communicate more effectively, both at work and outside of work. So what is communication? The Webster's definition is the imparting or exchanging of information or news. There's no mention of emotion in that definition, which I think is interesting. We'll kind of get into that as we talk through the different pieces in a little more detail. But we all inherently know that communication is important, and that's probably one of the reasons that you signed up for the webinar today. We're always communicating something, whether it's in our personal or professional lives. And now, more than ever, we should double down on our communication. If there was ever a time to over-communicate, it's now, while the world around us is so volatile. And one bonus of over-communication is it's really something you can control. So for all the things that we can't control right now, and for all of you control freaks that I know are out there, it's really time to dial in as we look more in more depth about what communication is. So, how do we communicate? Team meetings, face-to-face, email, written forms of communication, by phone, by virtual meeting. More and more, especially right now, we're communicating in the virtual space. So it's really important to still consider the right tool to use for the particular situation that you find yourself in. And there's another bonus with how, is that you can control that too. So we've covered the who, what, when, and how of communication. And we've talked about why communication is especially important right now, but it was really important before the COVID crisis, and it's going to be important long after the COVID crisis. So stepping back, we communicate in business to achieve our mission and business objectives. Timmons Group, this means that we want to obtain an unparalleled understanding of our clients, their businesses, and their visions, resulting in unrivaled customer service and shared success. I'm sure that you all have some version of a business mission or objective that relates to customer service. Think about the last time you had really great customer service. Now, think about the last time that you had really bad customer service. And this is the part that if we were all in the room together, we would erupt immediately into different stories and have a period of discussion, because we can all really relate to customer service experiences. And your clients, your team, your family aren't any different in this regard. But since we can't break into groups to talk about customer service, I'm going to share my most recent experience. So I just moved back in April. Yes, crazy, one of these crazy people that moved during COVID. And it turns out that we needed a new washing machine at our new house. And not wanting to go the easy way and just buy a new one, I dragged my whole family out to Amelia County, and we bought this used washing machine from this woman off of Facebook Marketplace. So we get back home, we plug it in, and there was an error code on the display board. And I'm thinking, like, yikes, I've just dragged like 4 people out to go get this, and we got it back, doesn't even work. But I quickly looked toward a solution, and I figured, well, I can put a little bit more money into this before it is a total waste of looking for something used instead of buying new. And I went ahead and reached out to a repair person. I got the estimate, and of course it was much more than I was planning on spending, even under that scenario, but that's the risk you take. It sort of didn't sit well with me though, because I felt like I had this good experience with this woman picking up the washing machine, and I didn't think that she was like deliberately trying to sell me something that didn't work. So I reached back out to her just to talk to her about it. And we concluded the circuit board must have been damaged based on the way that we moved it, because we moved it on its side. So I'm willing to admit my potential fault there. But here's where it got interesting for me after I got it repaired. Got it repaired, works great, love it, clean clothes. Several days later, she reached back out to me to ask how it was going, and just to reiterate that, how she felt bad about the situation and what had happened. And that really struck me because, I didn't know this woman before this interaction, probably will never see her again, but she cared so much about, that experience and her, the way I thought of her in that exchange, that, she pushed forward with that follow through, even though it might have been uncomfortable. And I was thinking, man, that's really the type of communication and follow through that I want to aspire towards having. Not that I'm going to go into used appliance sales anytime soon, but I think there's some universal truths that we can apply to all communications. And so what are those universal truths? According to authors Adams and Sue, it's being direct, honest, and respectful. And you really have to have all 3 or you'll miss the mark on this. So think about that with me for a moment. When you're direct, you say what you mean and you mean what you say. When you're honest, you're telling the truth. When you're respectful, you're kind, humble, show deference, and perhaps most importantly, you're ready to listen. Now, if you're new to direct communication, it's okay to practice when the stakes are small to prepare yourself for when the stakes are bigger. And so one way to do this, if you're in a restaurant, assuming you're going out, and the host asks if a certain booth is okay, it's appropriate to say, thank you, but I would prefer a table by the window. Now, if you're used to being direct, that might be a really obvious example, but I would consider you to think about using I language instead of you language. And so an example with this could be, you are always asking me to help with additional fundraising for the Little League group, and you just don't understand the different stresses I'm under. So this can be reimagined as, thank you for thinking of me, but I'm not able to take on that additional fundraising task this year. But I'm happy to recommend a replacement. And then be quiet and listen. You don't need to enumerate the reasons why you can't commit to another thing. But the second part of that response is what I like the most. If you have to decline something that someone's asked you to do or participate in, or if you have to deliver bad news, always be ready with that silver lining, like providing the idea for an alternate person or what a potential solution to the news you're trying to communicate is. And Roger will get into that in a little more detail when we talk about sensitive topics. But all these things really play into your communication style. So talking about communication styles, I've adapted this chart from Raheem's work on interpersonal conflict. And some things to consider when you're thinking about your communication style. Really, knowing yourself is important, but it's probably more important to understanding how your client prefers to communicate so that you can cater your style to meet that expectation. And as you're considering that, you want to think about, well, what is my client trying to accomplish versus what I might be trying to accomplish, and who are they going to then be turning around and trying to communicate with based on the information that I've given them. So the chart talks about different communication styles relative to our concerns for ourselves versus others in the relationship. And we can use this to sort of prioritize and steer, be in better control over some of our relationships with others. And so really how the chart works is on the x-axis across the bottom there, we're going from low to high, and that's with respect to our concern for others. And then on the y-axis, again, from low to high, from the bottom to the top, relating to the concern for ourselves. There we go.
Sorry, Amelia.
And that's okay. Gotta be adaptable. So at the bottom, where there's a low concern for self and a low concern for others, you might be inclined to avoid communication. But as you move up the y-axis, you have a higher concern for yourself, but a lower concern for others. And in that way, you might be coming off as competitive. As you move across the x-axis towards the right, where you have a low concern for yourself and a high concern for others, you might tend to be more accommodating of certain requests. And then on the upper right hand corner, where concern for others and concern for self is high, that's where we get into collaboration mode. Everyone's trying to make whatever item you're talking about work and work together to do that. But really the goal is to be, ready to compromise and move ahead through what you're trying to communicate. So a few takeaways before I hand it off to Scott about communication styles. And first of all, don't buy a used washing machine from the internet, in case you hadn't already picked up on that. But all kidding aside, it did work out great. It's a very nice washer. But when we're communicating, we need to ask questions and be ready to listen. We need to be active and not passive. You don't want to find yourself in that avoiding square. You want to be mindful and avoid taking things personally. And do you see how we've maybe restated direct, honest, and respectful in some of those takeaways? So I'll say, now that you're prepared to communicate effectively, Scott is going to take us through how to close the loop and set yourself up for effective project-specific communications.
Great. Thanks, Amelia. That's a great introductory segment into diving a little bit deeper into the basics of communication. Because we feel if you master the basics, then everybody can be effective communicators. My name is Scott Wiley. I lead the landscape architecture practice here in the Richmond office. And I've been with Timmons Group for 11 years and have held several different roles over that time. But the one thing that each role has had in common is that it revolves around successful communication. I'm going to continue with the overview of the basics, but in the AE industry, what are some of the more effective ways to go about project communication? Think about that as we go forward. If you look around your office, you can probably quickly identify those who are excellent communicators and those who are not. If we're all more intentional about the way we communicate, and with a little more practice, we can all be great communicators. So project managers are the quarterbacks of the team and often need to be the best communicators in our industry. Some of our principals and our CEOs are more like coaches, and they're likely already well versed in communication, while maybe other project team members are more like the players. You get the reference. The project manager is responsible for making sure that everyone is working from the same playbook. And there are many ways to do that, from meeting schedules to agendas to progress reports and emails. We'll run through some of these best practices when communicating during projects. Let's start with meetings. Meetings, and more meetings. That's the theme of today's work life, right? We're often overloaded with meetings and don't take the time we really need to step back and figure out how to make the most of our meetings. So here are a few best practices when setting up meetings. Sometimes setting up a meeting is the first touch point with a client or a new interaction, and we want to make sure that we email all the attendees with some possible dates. I like to choose 2, 3, 4 dates that work for me and our team internally and send them out, make a suggestion. Sometimes when multiple people are included, we'll use something like a doodle poll or a little bit more sophisticated to nail down the date, but be sure that everyone is included as well. It's not, a challenging thing to think through who needs to be included. There's nothing worse than forgetting to include someone really important to the meeting, scheduling the meeting only to find out that they are not available, having to go through that process again, and that sort of looks silly as our first interaction with a client. Meeting types, we've kind of gone over some of these. Amelia touched on them, but there's face-to-face, web-based, phone conference, recurring weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly meetings, which are often really important. We're also well-versed with web meetings these days that this has replaced most in-person meetings, or at least for the immediate future. But I can't stress enough how important it is to run these web meetings as if they were in person. From the way you dress, to your background, to your preparation, put the time in to be successful and make sure you leave an impression. Okay, so the meeting is set. You have 2 attendees or you have 200 attendees joining. What next? This can really vary based on the importance of the meeting, the number of attendees, the nature of public versus private work, but in general, best practices suggest that we should send out an agenda in advance. I like to do this 2 or 3 days in advance if at all possible. If not, maybe make some edits to the agenda on the fly during the meeting, but follow that agenda. Set clear goals as to what you're trying to accomplish within the meeting. Let's not have meetings for the sake of having meetings. Let's be intentional. Take detailed notes, or if you're unable to because you're presenting most of the material, let's make sure we have someone there to scribe the notes and then send them out to all attendees afterwards. Let's record important meetings. That used to be fairly challenging, but now with online web-based meetings, we can just click a button and have an instant record of that meeting to send to someone who wasn't able to attend, or to create as a living record of that project. Really important in public work. Keep to the allotted time. We all have extremely busy schedules these days, sometimes meeting after meeting, running back to back. We're not accounting for travel time as much as we used to. So sometimes we're lining up meetings, one after the other. So let's keep to the allotted time. Close on a note of achievement and action items. I like this one. This is one of my favorite. Let's be positive. Let's end the meeting on a positive note. You might have discussed some really challenging topics during a meeting, but let's end on something positive and follow up when critical items have been completed. If you follow these practices, I think your meetings will be more productive. Digging a little deeper here, I would be remiss if I didn't run through the basics of agendas. What should be in the agenda? To me, content and agenda should identify the meeting goals. We talked about that. Should ask participants for input. So you could do that a couple days in advance if you have the opportunity, or it could be right there at the outset of a meeting. Let's list the questions that need to be addressed during the meeting. Let's not have an aimless meeting where we don't really know why we're meeting or what we're talking about. Let's list some specific questions and goals for each meeting. Identify the purpose of each task. Maybe estimate the amount of time to spend on each topic to keep us on track. Determine who leads each topic. Sometimes if you have multiple people helping to run a meeting, it might be important on an agenda to identify who's leading each topic if it's a particularly long meeting or an all-day charrette perhaps. And finally, end with review and action within the agenda. Again, if you follow these rules, I think you'll be much more prepared to facilitate the meeting. Moving from agendas, let's talk about progress reports. In my experience, good communicators who use progress reports as a communication tool are better able to track progress with the client and with other project consultants. Progress reports can also identify completed tasks and what needs to be completed thereafter. One of my favorites, prove that monthly billing is aligned with project status. How often have you sent out an invoice only to get a question from your client on, well, we didn't really think your project was this far along. But perhaps if you've been sending progress reports more frequently than a monthly invoice, we could hit that, right at the outset. Provide regular schedule updates. I think that's a key importance of progress reports. And as Roger will talk about, maybe sometimes progress reports could identify challenges in communicating, unexpected issues or challenges along the way. This is definitely an extreme example, but I'll give you an example of using diligent progress reports. We've been working with a locality to design and implement a new gateway sign along one of their corridors. And the initial process started 3.5 years ago and has stopped and started several times due to changes in funding priorities. But now here we are in the project under construction, and we've generated over 100 progress reports to date, issued every other week over the life of the project. While that's an extreme example, I think it does highlight how progress reports can be used as a log or a record of activity for that project for the life of the project, which I think is especially important in public work. This goes without saying, but a good communicator is one who stays on top of and well ahead of a project schedule. Schedules can keep all stakeholders informed of milestones. A good communicator will use the schedule to look ahead and see those upcoming milestones and orchestrate the necessary people and tools to meet those demands. We suggest that you update the schedule regularly, especially as the project evolves, runs into hurdles, or progresses more quickly, which I'll say rarely ever happens. We use Microsoft Project and Smartsheet, but there are other tools out there that you may be more comfortable with. I have found most success with Smartsheet because it's easily shared and viewed on a browser or in a mobile app by all of the project consultants or your client with just the touch of a button. But most importantly, managing schedules effectively can be one of the most critical tools in communication that we have at our disposal. And finally, emails. How many emails do we send and receive each day? Studies show that the average worker in today's business receives 120 emails per day, and they send 40. Sounds pretty typical for me, but that's a lot of emails. We've all read about different strategies and tips to writing emails, but here are those that we think are most critical to good communication. Keep them short and to the point. Let's not write a novel. Let's be concise about what we're trying to convey. Let's use the subject line appropriately. That subject line is likely going to be replied to or forwarded or saved for record for future use. Let's make sure it relates to the project or the subject matter at hand. Small detail, but important. Identify the purpose of the email. Make sure you're very clear in why you're sending an email. We've all gotten emails before when you read 2 or 3 lines and you just have no idea what the person is trying to communicate. Be very clear and communicative. Proof important emails prior to sending. Again, Roger's going to talk about communicating sensitive topics, and email's not the first choice for doing that, but when you do, so by email, it's not a bad idea to have a second person read that email to make sure that the content is appropriate and the tone is appropriate. Be aware of size attachment limits. Sometimes when those emails kick back and you have to send it again, you don't know which recipients got the email, which recipients didn't, and that can be confusing. And then finally, I like to file our emails, really well and organized in Outlook or backed up to the project directory more locally. And if you follow some of those strategies, I can assure you your emails will be more straight to the point and you will appear as a better communicator. But with that, I'll turn it over to Roger Rodriguez, who's going to cover communication around sensitive topics.
Thank you, Scott. Pleasure to be here today. For those that don't know me, I'm Roger Rodriguez. I'm a managing principal in our commercial services group, and I'm located here in our Richmond, Virginia headquarters office. I've been with Timmons Group about 20 years, and my background is mostly, as you would imagine from the title, in commercial, multifamily, retail, and also industrial from time to time. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about sensitive topics and what creates sensitive topics and how we can go about getting that information across the goal line with the client. So let's start with what makes a sensitive topic. And I've got a couple of seed ideas here on the presentation slide. And again, these are not meant to be exhaustive, but they are a couple of things that would create sensitivity when you're communicating with external parties. Anything that involves money, either going in or coming out, or going up or going down, could be a sensitive topic, especially when you start messing around with pro formas or development budgets that have been funded already. That can get to be a sensitive area pretty quick. You may have changes in schedule that you need to tackle. You may have some uncertain future about the project, and that could be created by several influencing factors, either internal or external. You could have some unforced errors. As my friend Bill Buckner would remind everybody, those do happen from time to time, and thankfully he's recovered nicely from his. But we're not perfect. We are in a real estate and development and construction industry, and things will happen. So recovering from those and communicating throughout the process is the key to success there. So I wanted to take a little bit and talk about why we might avoid sensitive topics. And again, you'll see a couple of seed ideas here, not exhaustive, but a couple of common reasons, especially for younger staff members in the industry, why sensitive topics might be avoided. You could have some uncertainty about how that information is going to be received and reacted to by the recipient. It's certainly not fun content when you have things like schedule and time moving around, especially for as much as we're trying to crunch project schedules and project budgets these days. You may have some inexperience leading to fear about the sensitive topics that you have to convey. And if you do have fear, it's okay to identify that. Those are good opportunities to reach out to a peer or a mentor, somebody that can coach you through how to navigate those waters. Myself, being in the industry for 20 years, I've definitely been through my share of miscues over my career, and I enjoy those opportunities to tutor folks that aren't as experienced as I. And there's still times when I encounter things for the first time, and I look to my peers and supervisors for advice on how to navigate those situations. So I laid out a couple of things that could create sensitive information, sensitive topics in the first slide. I want to dive into each one of those a little bit deeper. You saw time and schedule on there pretty prominently. There could be several reasons for time and schedule change, both internal, external. You could have something that happens in construction that was unforeseen. It could be a buried condition. It could be a legacy condition if you're doing renovation of an existing building. Walls finally get pulled back and, oh my gosh, we didn't know that there was asbestos pipe here. We didn't know that unmarked utility was under the slab. So understanding the reasons for the change would inform how we go about reacting to it. And a couple of remedies when you do get into schedule situations that you have to overcome. You could look at opportunities to run tasks concurrently. Everything doesn't need to be nose to tail. Speaking to the schedule slide that Scott had up here earlier, if you've got a good project schedule built in the beginning, you know where the dependencies are and you can start to slide things around accordingly. Maybe you could staff the project differently. You know, you could bring in your A+ players and, you know, get to the finish line quicker. You could look at other options for schedule acceleration, working overtime, nights and weekends. And whenever you do get into a situation where schedule becomes a concern or schedule is running behind where it was projected, it's good to reiterate the process and the dependencies. Everybody that is a stakeholder in the project, whether they're a consultant or an investor, they need to understand what has to come first before the next 2 or 3 steps can happen. And since we're in the real estate industry, it is always very important to understand if there's a land transaction that is part of your project, and specifically if there's any due diligence periods that have specific expiration dates. A lot of times those things will create obligations to move forward with closing, and it's good to know when those cutoff dates are because they can create things that will pop up to the top of the priority list very quickly. Cost impacts is another area that could create some sensitive topic discussions. As you know, we've got hard costs and soft costs that go into a project, and a little deeper into the soft cost side, there are things that are foreseeable when you're scoping the job in the beginning. And then there's things that are legitimate design change orders, changes and adjustments in the project scope from the investors or stakeholders. Maybe they want to move from 200 multifamily units to 210 multifamily units. And depending on your area of the project design, that could be a material change in your scope. So it's good to understand that you do have options when costs do change in the course of the project. There's always alternate designs and products. If you come up with a construction issue that creates a cost impact, I always like to do a very thorough job of scoping alternatives when we write proposals at Timmons Group. You may not be certain that elements of design are going to be absolutely necessary when you're scoping the project, but you may have kind of a gut feel that, hey, the last time I did a project of this type or this size or in this particular area of the state, we had to do a sewage pump station. So I don't know for certain that's going to be needed, but I'm going to put in here an add alternate in case it does come up. And that way, when it does come up, if it does become a job requirement, you've got a reference line to go back to and say, hey, we thought this may come up and here's what that would look like. Something that I'd like to drive home to our younger staff going to this bottom bullet point is not to rely on plan notes, especially if we have very sensitive information that could escalate the cost of a project. I mentioned the pump station example. We were doing a multifamily project in a particularly flat area of the state. And when we were doing our initial design, we had identified pretty quickly that the separation of 2 gravity pipes was going to be very tight. And if the separation didn't work physically, then a pump station was going to be necessary, and that was going to be a significant add to the job. Unfortunately, with all of the studies and advanced imaging that we did, there was no way to know for certain until earth got pulled back and the road asphalt got removed to know the true elevation of the pipe. So not only did we have notes in the plans, but we reiterated with the developer and the contractor that this is something very early in the construction cycle you want to confirm is the exact elevation of that pipe so that we know as early as possible in the construction cycle if that's something that's going to become necessary for the pump station for the project. And while notes on the plan are fine, verbal communication is always advisable when you have something that's that critical. You may have project change and uncertainty that comes up. It may be a process change, which quite honestly, in the last 6 months, we've all seen changes to review processes and permitting processes that have been driven by the global pandemic. You may have material changes to the product. I noted before, there may be an expansion to the project programming that you have to incorporate midway through design. So it's important to understand where that's coming from, remaining sensitive to what's driving the need for the project change, having empathy if it's something that you didn't create, but it's something will probably push the schedule or push the cost of the project. How you handle that, how you react to it, especially if it's going to create more work for you as a design consultant, it will go a long way in how the owner views you moving forward. And I mentioned scoping alternatives in the proposal in the very beginning of the project. I also would advocate scoping a very thorough project understanding narrative that goes with your proposal. And not all proposal formats will allow for this. But if you do have the opportunity to author your proposal from start to finish and you're not condensed into an AIA strict format, it's good to have some very thorough background of assumptions, what your basis of understanding is as you put your fee and scope together. Some things to keep in mind as you're communicating sensitive topics. I'm going to kind of start at the top right corner and move clockwise. I always advocate having options. If you approach the project stakeholders with binary choices of you do this, or we can just fold everything up and start over, those are not very appealing choices. We quite often have many design alternatives that we can evaluate, and they all have to be valid choices. They've all got to pass the sniff test if you're going to put them on the table as an option. Being sensitive to who's picking up the tab for project change or schedule change, and what happens after you deliver the sensitive information to your contact point. Quite oftentimes, we deal with an owner's representative or a project manager of an organization, and if we deliver sensitive or unsavory information to them about the project, they've got to pass it up the line in their organization, and that could be to a CEO, a CFO, a boardroom. So just understanding what that person's going to have to do with the information may inform how you approach the conversation. And avoiding surprises and always continuously managing expectations of project stakeholders will avoid sensitivity of certain things that pop up along the way. From time to time, we do have to deliver bad news as project designers. Construction changes, schedule pushes, things happen. Maybe it's an unforced error, as I noted to on my earlier slide. And these are just a couple of bullet points. We could do an entire webinar for probably a couple of hours on how to deliver and handle bad news, but I've got a couple of what I think are keystones of how to handle these communications. The first thing is to act quickly and stay on top of it. Bad news does not get better with age. We've all heard the adage of it does not behave like fine wine. It doesn't get better the longer that it sits around. When you first learn about bad news, you should immediately begin thinking about when and how you're going to inform your client. That doesn't mean you pick up the phone the very next second. It's important to take a breath, organize your thoughts, come up with a couple of options. And if you think coming up with those options may take a day or two, pick up the phone anyway. Let them know that you're aware of the issue and tell them when you're going to get back with them. Never hide the facts. Anything that they can discover without you telling them, they need to hear from you. You don't want them uncovering something that you may have masked because it made you look better. If you've got something that you need to take responsibility for, step up to the front of the line and take responsibility for it. And then you can go about the work of resolving that issue. I would already mention presenting multiple options whenever you possibly can. And how you communicate in times of adversity is extremely important. I always favor face-to-face communications. And if that's not possible because of distance and separation, then a live discussion on the phone is very personal. It's very professional. Don't feel like you have to get 18 stakeholders lined up into a meeting to break the news, because by that time it may be 4 days old. If you've got a regularly recurring OAC meeting that happens every 2 weeks and the next one is a week and a half away, don't wait that week and a half to divulge that information in an open setting. Get on the phone with a couple of key stakeholders. Maybe it's your owner, maybe your owner and your GC, and let them know what's happened. Get in front of it. It will probably be discussed at the next OAC meeting, but you don't have to wait until that time to bring it up for the first opportunity. Summarizing with follow-up emails, as you saw from some of Scott's slides, is very important, but that's not the way that you lead into the conversation for the first time. Being authentic, being empathetic to the situation. If it's something that you didn't create, but it's going to cause rework on your particular design, being empathetic to your partner consultants. We work in a relatively small real estate development world when you get down to it, regardless of which city or locality you operate in. You will probably see these folks again on the next job, and just treat everybody how you would prefer to be treated in the end. And lastly, but certainly not least, it's important to manage yourself and help to manage others. You may be relying on another consultant's design or a locality review before you can completely bring a situation to resolution. But that doesn't mean that you just punt the ball into the other party's court. If you have to transact information and wait for return correspondence, following up on that, staying on top of it so that you can deliver a complete solution for your client is very critical. I appreciate your attention to that. I'm going to hand it over to Drew Gould to talk about communication amongst the team.
Thank you, Roger. It's rarely fun delivering or receiving bad news, so appreciate those thoughts. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Drew Gould. I'm a principal here at Timmons Group. I've been here about 26 years. My background is in stormwater management and urban infill development, and I currently oversee our public land development division. I'm going to speak about 3 specific types of project interactions. The first is with our internal design team. The next is with our external design team partners. And then lastly, interacting with plan reviewers and regulators. So communicating with our internal production team. I'm a big believer in effective and well-planned project kickoff meetings. Give the project some context. Why is it interesting and unique? Why is it needed? What are the community benefits of the project? And what are some of the design challenges? Sometimes those of us leading a project have been involved with it for months or more, and we forget that some of our design team may be seeing it for the first time. So share the client's vision and get your team excited about the opportunity. I encourage you to be very specific about scope, budget, schedule, and expected deliverables. Talk about dollars, talk about specific dates, talk about how you're going to run the project and how often the team will be meeting. This is our chance to get the project started in the right direction. I think this is the time where there is the highest risk to waste schedule or waste budget if I don't do a good job providing very specific direction. Once you've had that kickoff discussion, ask if everyone is comfortable with their assignment. Make eye contact. Make sure you get a nod or a yes. It's good to follow up with an email to confirm roles and responsibilities and critical information. Check in over the shoulder regularly to make sure that you have communicated accurately and your team is heading in the right direction. That can be a challenge with team members working remotely, but there are good tools to do that. We've had great luck with Microsoft Teams for those regular check-ins. Be sure to understand competing priorities. In many instances, our production teams have other projects they are working on. Does each team member have the availability and capacity to put in the hours needed? Look for nonverbals here. Sometimes people are reluctant to articulate they have concerns about workload. Sighs, deep breaths, a lot of ums and ahs are generally bad signs. Don't ignore them. Talk about their concerns. If we need to bring in additional people or adjust staffing, best to do that early in the process rather than later on. So now we have our internal project team up and running. Let's talk about communicating with our design team partners. We are likely working with architects, engineers, contractors, and clients outside of our walls. So who on your internal project team is empowered to communicate with the outside team, and in what circumstances? Understand how your client prefers to communicate and who they are comfortable communicating with on your team. We generally encourage peer-to-peer communication. This can be a very efficient way to communicate. It helps grow deeper relationships with teaming partners and gives people an opportunity to practice their communication skills. But make sure you have a system to keep the project manager or principal in the loop. Make sure your team is communicating back to the project manager about what communication is happening and with whom. And make sure your communication is documented as needed. And it is especially important to make sure appropriate staff level is leading the sensitive or critical items that Roger just spoke about. Now that we have our internal team rolling, we're communicating effectively with our outside design team. We now must deal with authorities having jurisdiction, or more typically, plan reviewers. I think this is one of the most difficult and important things that we do. Our relationship with plan reviewers is very important. Clients sometimes seek recommendations on which consultant to use from local governments. Sometimes plan reviewers will sit on selection committees when localities award term contracts. And then there's the financial benefit. Roughly 40% of our design budgets are consumed during the permitting process. If we can minimize iterations or reduce the number of comments needed to be addressed, we can save time and money. So for all those reasons, we want to have a strong relationship with plan reviewers. But we also know that our clients expect us to advocate and negotiate, sometimes aggressively, on their behalf. So how do we balance these two perspectives? First, invest and grow the relationship with reviewers who you regularly work with. Be known for submitting well-designed plans so reviewers look forward to seeing your work. Know the local requirements. When you are addressing comments, confirm what is being asked with a phone call or a face-to-face meeting. Be thorough so you minimize the number of review cycles needed, and always be professional. At times you may be frustrated, but try not to let it show. So how do we address conflicts when they arise? Inevitably, we're going to run into some sticky situations. Take the time to understand the reviewer's perspective. The better we can do that, the better prepared we'll be to find an agreeable solution. Be proactive on things that you know are likely to be an issue. Meet in advance to discuss critical issues with decision makers from both sides. Provide sound technical ideas and seek a technical solution first. It's okay to elevate issues up the chain of command, but don't short circuit the process. Here's a quick project example. This was not a Timmins project, but I was involved in an adjacent road improvement, so I had a first row seat for this exchange. At issue is a streetscape section with new pedestrian scale lighting. The AHJ has a requirement that the street light be a certain minimum distance set back from the curb. That requirement could not be met in this case due to a large, shallow electrical duct bank. Rather than approaching this from the city's perspective, the designer talked about many examples in the city where the existing condition did not meet that requirement. They argued that if it was okay in other places, then why not here? They also started copying city council representatives on emails. When asked the actual depth of the top of the duct bank and whether a shallow foundation for the light pole would work, they didn't have that information. And to make matters worse, the contractor proceeded to install some of the pole foundations prior to city approval and prior to any discussion about the issue. Not surprisingly, this exchange did not go well and took many weeks to resolve. The reason the city requires a setback is they are the ones to maintain the street lights and have to regularly replace light poles that are too close to the curb because they are damaged by car doors or vehicles jumping the curb. Their department pays for the new poles, and they are the ones that respond to residents and business owners' complaints when lights are out and poles are damaged. So the designer's approach to remind them of all the areas in the city that currently did not meet this code only enforced their resolve to make sure that no other poles were installed too close to the curb. So let's apply the ideas that we just talked about. Understand the city's perspective. Be proactive about a potentially sensitive issue. Hey guys, I have a concern about a light pole location on this project. I understand your code requirement and why that code is important, but there's a duck bank in the way. Any chance we can meet on site to discuss? We've looked at ways to protect the poles from damage. We understand the depth of the duck bank and have considered a shallow foundation. Ultimately, this was resolved by getting a variance to the required distance behind the curb and then sliding the poles to locations where there was no on-street parking or where there was a curb bump out that would minimize the chance of the poles being damaged. And this is a simple example with relatively small cost and schedule impacts, but you can see how the approach to this conflict can greatly impact its resolution. And with that, I'm going to kick this back to Sarah to lead our Q&A session. Sarah?
Y'all have provided some great information today. Again, if y'all have questions, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. But for now, I'm going to kick it back to Roger on the delivering the bad news portion of the presentation. Can you describe your approach for taking responsibility while also balancing liability?
There's times for both. It's an excellent question because one thing that could be revolving around a younger or even a more experienced person's mind when taking responsibility is, oh no, if I take responsibility, then I just bought that problem and I'm going to have to explain that up my chain of command. There is a time to discuss the liability and the who's paying. But if you put that at the very front of the problem, you're never going to get to the resolution as quickly. It's important to identify the issue, start immediately discussing how to resolve it, not financially, but from a design perspective. And then there will be a time when you have to settle up if it's something that is a problem that you created either through an error or an omission in your design, that you have to have that discussion. That's quite often a smaller group. And sometimes those need to happen at a faster pace because it's in the middle of construction and we're bumping up against a loan draw, and that's going to be very critical because the contractor's executed on work and they want to get paid. But I advocate separating those discussions because they may happen in different groups. You probably have more people speaking into how to resolve a situation than the number of people speaking into who's going to pay for it, how they're going to pay for it, and when.
We're going to stay with you, Roger, here. You spoke multiple times on unforced errors. Can you provide some examples for us?
Sure. Some things I've seen over the course of my career, and these come from all walks of the design realm. People referencing outdated standards, people using the incorrect code references from a zoning ordinance, designers not having a full copy of all of the zoning conditions that may apply particularly to a property. As designers, we're responsible for knowing all of that. But as I mentioned a couple of times, things do happen in this business, and we're human beings and nobody's perfect. So that's an example of an unforced error. It's something that information was readily available in the public realm. Maybe we did an incomplete job in due diligence or project investigation and overlooked a certain item that we should have had on our radar screen. And again, I've seen that from civil engineers, MEPs, architects, structurals, contractors. Everybody is subject to that.
We're going to go with you on this one. With COVID and quarantine and so many people working from home and the lack of face-to-face interaction, have you seen any specific challenges through communication recently?
Yeah, so let me take a crack at that. So, you know, in the design profession, where we work most of the time, we try to encourage a very collaborative environment, both within our team, but then also with our, you know, architectural partners and engineers. And so The ability to get everybody in the same room and pour over a set of plans or drawings has been, impacted greatly over the past few months. So that's been a challenge. In probably mid-March, probably 80% of our Timmins Group team elected to work from home. And that has worked surprisingly well. I think we've used the technology like Microsoft Teams, like Zoom very well. We've all learned a lot about that. We all learned very quickly to turn on our cameras. That didn't used to be part of our culture. Even when we were on meeting platforms like that, a lot of people were calling in or they weren't turning on their cameras. And that's something that we changed quickly, and we realized the benefit of doing that. There's still a challenge when you can't be in the same room as your client or with the architect, but a lot of these virtual platforms have helped greatly. I also think there's going to be lasting impacts from this. I think our work from home policy will change as a result of this. I think when we choose to travel for projects and be in the same room might change from this. But again, I hope we get back to more closely to normal of where we were. But for the time being, we've been able to make this work pretty well.
While we are waiting for more questions to come in, I just want to throw out a couple more reminders. Again, this presentation is worth one LU credit via for AIA, so all attendees will receive certificate of completions from us via email, so be on the lookout for that. Also, we do have another webinar coming up in a couple of weeks. It is RFP, Request for Personality, When People Win Work. So visit our website at www.timmins.com to register for that. I don't believe anybody else has any questions. I think y'all did a great job explaining everything to everybody, and hopefully everyone who attended here can leave today with a couple tips and tricks to help your project management and step it up a notch. So thank you everybody for attending, and thank you all for speaking, and we hope you have a great and wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you,
Bye, everyone.
Sarah.